On January 27, 2021, the Net Zero Oceanographic Capability Project held their first workshop aimed at engaging stakeholders with questions surrounding Work Package 1 on future science needs. Here I'm going to talk through a summary of some of the key discussion points that came out of the workshop. In the first session, we asked stakeholders to discuss what they thought the main science drivers were in UK marine studies, looking forward into the next 15-20 years. Overall, there was a general theme that we need to move from broad correlations to understanding processes and the mechanisms underlying these processes in order to have better predictive power and confidence in projections into the future. Very broadly, the discussions around ocean science fell broadly into these three categories: process studies, sustained observations, and forecasting. There were a number of common themes that you can see listed there, but the recurring questions that came up time and time again are shown here on the right-hand side. How do we capture the range of spatial and temporal scales? And how do we most effectively communicate scientific output? There was also discussion on future data requirements, and this can be broadly separated into two different types of data. Firstly, modelling data. There were several discussions surrounding the need for improved model validation and better collaboration in study design between observational scientists and modellers. And then in terms of observational data, there was a clear need for increased data acquisition, but also coming with that, improved data management and accessibility and improved use of existing data. Moving on, the second session was really about possibilities. We asked the stakeholders to discuss how transformational technologies could be used to address the key science drivers that had been identified. Some common themes appeared in the discussions, largely around very ambitious ideas of high-resolution, fully integrated real-time measurements of the ocean, mapping the entire sea floor, and multidisciplinarity when it comes to our scientific approaches, in particular in terms of time series. There were some subject-specific ideas, in particular the idea that perhaps some of the analyses currently requiring sampling in situ could be carried out automatically instead. So these impacted subjects such as deep sea biology and geology, including sedimentology, paleoclimate, hard rock geology, and geophysics. More specifically, there was a discussion on various different types of transformational technologies, including various platforms, such as underwater automated vehicles, autonomous surface vehicles, underwater observatories, and other platforms such as airships, planes, and drones. There was also some discussion on the use of satellites and remote sensing, so more use of these remote sensing products, but also better calibration with ocean observations. And lastly, there was wide discussion on sensors. So are there new measurements that we can make using lab-on-chip or microfluidic technologies? Can we use miniaturized tags on animals? Can we use other biosensors? And then are there ways for getting higher quality measurements and for fitting more sensors per platform to improve our observations? There was also some discussion on how these different technologies might interconnect, and this might help to improve efficiency, for example through the use of smart, adaptable, autonomous deployments from ships, better planning of observations using models or ocean digital twins, and also improving access to ships. We could also engage better with the power and energy sector to improve power supplies for the new technologies and making ships more efficient. And lastly, we should link with computer technology and automation sectors to improve human-machine interfaces and data visualization, and to engage with machine learning and artificial intelligence. Then in the third session, we moved on to the potential challenges of future marine science research in the UK. One of the key themes here was that of the carbon footprint of seagoing research, with the recurring question, how do we compute the carbon footprint of our research in the first place? There was a lot of discussion about the carbon cost of the research at all stages, from manufacture to disposal. How can we maximise the scientific value while minimising harm, in particular relating to marine litter due to unrecovered equipment and the environmental cost of power supplies? And lastly, there was some discussion on strategies to reduce carbon footprints in the first place. Then there was some discussion about whether gaps could be created by a fully autonomous approach in the future. Could we potentially limit UK marine science to parameters and disciplines that can be measured autonomously? Particular scientific disciplines that could be at risk are those that require heavy infrastructure, so for example deep sea biology or geology requiring drilling or collection of large or live samples. Also disciplines that require manipulation of the environment or high levels of accuracy, or any science requiring particular parameters that are not straightforwardly measured by autonomous sensors. Other challenges include platform reliability and impacts on particular science projects or long-term monitoring programs, any measurements at interfaces that are particularly challenging. And then there's the possibility that technology appropriate for one environment is not appropriate for another. So, for example, technology used in observations of the open ocean may be challenging in coastal environments. And lastly, there's a risk that a lack of calibration between established methods and transformational technologies could create uncertainty in the measurement that will decrease the value of the data. Another theme that came up as a key challenge is the vast dynamic range of scales within the ocean in terms of temporal scales from seconds to decades and spatial scales from the microscopic to the basin-wide. Now, there are opportunities that autonomous platforms provide in terms of addressing these different spatial and temporal scales, including adaptive sampling, swarms, and access to remote environments. However, there's also a potential gap that arises using autonomous technology if that technology does not respond quickly enough to the changes within the oceans. Another question that was discussed broadly between the stakeholders is how are we going to deal with the data explosion that will arise from the rise in autonomous technology? We need to maximise data value, not just quantity, so we need to have good quality data curation, data access, quality control and assurance, calibration and validation, and we need to establish a new set of best practices. We're also going to need an increase in bandwidth from autonomous platforms and ships to shore so that we can enable dynamic decisions on sampling. We can then enable a shoreside team to complement the team at sea. And all of this would require much more reliable broadband and faster connections. There were also some known unknowns identified as well throughout the workshop. Firstly, we don't know how trends and sectors are going to develop in the next few years. For example, in the oil and gas industry, in environmental management, and in legal implications of these autonomous devices. Who is responsible, for example, if an autonomous platform causes a collision? Then there are unknown trends in technologies, including energy systems, communications, cloud-based computing, robustness of technologies in harsh environments, and the conflict between low and high technologies. Then there was some discussion around funding. How are we going to fund this transition towards more autonomous science? So, who is going to fund an increase in the autonomy in the first place? At present, most autonomous costs are devolved into project applications. Is there a new funding model possible that's analogous to centralised ship support that could cover the costs instead? Also, whilst this transition is going on, we need to be able to run both the new methods and old methods at the same time to ensure there is confidence in the transformational technologies used. Is there a risk that new technology might be overtaken mid-development by even newer technology? And then how are we going to fund the transition to net zero carbon? Firstly, who is going to fund any carbon offsetting? Who is responsible? Should there be some sort of carbon tax? And then who is going to fund the improvements required to develop carbon efficiency in our oceanographic capability? So, for example, is that going to need the fundamental change in how the research councils fund cruises in order to make sure that all the berths on ships are filled? Who is going to fund the new communication links required? And lastly, there was some discussion surrounding the human implications of increased autonomy into the future. There were some positives identified, including broadening access to observational marine science, which has implications for equality, diversity and inclusivity, a reduced carbon footprint of travel to ships, and a potential increase in data usage and utility. However, there were also some negatives identified too, a potential loss of human interaction with the ocean, reduced opportunities for training, especially for early career researchers, a potential reduction in data quality due to reduced scientist interaction with the data, potentially a loss of interaction within the community and networking, and a potential for loss of recruitment as seagoing research is seen as an attractive, unique selling point, especially when encouraging early career researchers into the field. And there's clearly going to be a need for a shift in skill set requirements. For scientists, this might mean a shift towards data scientists, and for technicians, this might mean that there is a need for staff who are qualified in operating remotely piloted platforms. Thank you for your time in helping us gather the views of the community. For more information about the NZOC project, please visit our website.